Part 2. The Legend. Chapter 9. In the early part of 1863, the Fuller sisters had spent a lot of time in Virginia City, plotting and planning their caper. Finally, the day came, and they managed to get away with a shipment of gold and silver. Immediately, they took the treasure out into the hills and buried it, where they intended to leave it until the frenzy surrounding the robbery died down. Things would have been fine, too, if they hadn't run out of money. The Fuller sisters were as resourceful as they were audacious. Heading down to Carson City, they robbed the bank. The job should have gone smoothly. It was the same heist they'd pulled off time and time again. An early morning break-in, get in and out before anybody's even awake. But this time, something went wrong. Rushing through the bank's back door, the girls mounted their horses and headed around front. They were, for all intents and purposes, well on their way out of town, until they ran into the sheriff and his deputy. Maggie knew right away that the sheriff must have had a pretty good idea about what he'd happened upon, but she doubted he knew the well-disguised bandits were women. The lawmen's sudden appearance did little to dissuade the sisters. It didn't stop them from trying to make a break for it by splitting up and heading out in different directions. The sheriff drew his weapon. Unaware of the outlaw's gender, he raised his gun and aimed at the closest one. A shot rang out, and Maggie's heart leapt into her throat. She couldn't bear the thought of one of her sisters being shot. She glanced over her shoulder. The deputy's gun was drawn. He hesitated. Even with the distance between them, Maggie could easily guess that he was trying to decide who to aim for. After a few seconds of indecision, he turned his gun on Maggie. Maggie nudged her horse, Lightning, with a kick of her heels and a sharp whistle. Lightning picked up speed. Then the second shot rang out. Maggie closed her eyes and sucked in a deep breath, somehow realizing what was coming. The bullet pierced her shoulder. She wasn't about to let a little thing like getting shot interfere with her getaway. She nudged Lightning again. They needed to move faster. She had no idea her little sister Molly had been shot, much less killed. Maggie's instincts took over, driving her toward the forest surrounding Lake Tahoe. The wooded area was the only place in the barren desert that she was going to find cover. Blood poured from the awkward injury on the edge of her shoulder, but she convinced herself to ignore it, for now. She rode several miles before she felt safe enough to stop and tend her wound. She hid behind a brushy pinyon pine and fumbled with the scarf around her neck, untying it with one hand. She used it to apply pressure to her injury, and within seconds blood had soaked through the scarf. Confusion distorted her ability to think. Maggie stumbled back into the bristles of the tree, but felt nothing of the prickling pine needles. Her mind faded into deeper darkness. She fought it, but the task was too great. Maggie slumped to the ground, and her head hit a rock. She slipped into unconsciousness. About a mile away, Tejon was riding bareback through the forest on his magnificent pony, Pico. The horse maintained a steady pace as Tejon dodged the trees. Wind whipped his waist-length hair. Pine needles scraped his bare torso. He urged Pico to go faster. He loved nothing better than riding in the forest at full speed. He never actually lost track of where he was, but sometimes he would get a little surprised at how far he'd ridden. There was a time, when he was younger, that he'd misjudge his surroundings and end up tangling with the limb of a tree. Those days, the tree always won. But those days were long gone. These days he could ride through the forest with his eyes closed, and he could do it on any horse. Tejon continued on his outing that fateful day, reining his pony to a trot as he approached a thicket. The stationary horse up ahead caught his eye. His own horse fell into a slow gait, and he scanned the area. Nothing. He saw no one hiding in the shadows. Just a body lying on the ground a few feet in front of him. He gave the area another quick inspection and slid off his horse. At first, he took the body for a white man, but as he got closer, he saw that it was a white woman dressed in the white man's clothing. Tejon slid off Pico easily and knelt beside her. Her fiery hair was bright, brighter than anything he'd ever seen. He'd heard about the white man's woman, how some of them had yellow or red hair. At first, he, like everyone else in the tribe, thought that notion to be quite the tall tale. But as more and more of the whites invaded the land, his people began to see that the strange traits weren't myths after all. He wanted to touch her hair, but hesitated. It was so much like fire. He thought it might have the capability to burn his hand. Temptation got the better of him. Gently, he pushed her hair out of her face. Her alabaster skin was pale, drained of life. Still, she had the most beautiful face he'd ever seen. Intrigue thundered through his heart. This was a woman he had to know better. Then it hit him. What if she was dead? Tejon touched his fingertips against her neck and felt a faint heartbeat. He let out a sigh. If she was still alive, then his father would fix her. He was sure of that. Tejon's people, the Washoe, were natives to Lake Tahoe and the surrounding valley areas of Nevada. In the winter, late fall, and early spring, the tribe lived in numerous smaller communities, each with about 10 or 15 lodges situated in the clearings around the wooded areas of the campground. Only during the summer did the people come together as a whole at the lake. Approaching his particular tribal campground, Tejon carried the still unconscious white woman in his arms. Her horse voluntarily followed behind them. The children caught sight of his return and, as with tradition, they scurried out to greet him. But he was much too preoccupied on this day to play with the youngsters as he usually did. Without a word, he carried Maggie into his father's lodge. He had confidence that his father, Timiko, the shaman of the tribe, would help her. "She has been shot," he told his father in their native tongue. "Lay her by the fire." Timiko was much calmer than his son. Tejon stayed with the stranger he'd rescued while his father tended to her. She didn't move. She didn't open her eyes. He watched her face. He'd never held much regard for the white man. He didn't know the white man, and he didn't want to. Until now, he would have thought he could easily leave a white woman, just as a white man, lying in the forest to bleed to death. From the moment he'd gazed upon her flaming red hair and pulled it back out of her alluring face, something about her twisted around him and wouldn't let him go. He could not walk away and leave her there to die. Chapter 10. The Washoe spent their winters in the valley areas of the Lake Tahoe foothills. In the late spring, they'd move up to the east shore of the lake, where they'd remain throughout the summer. To the Washoe, the lake was sacred, so desecration was not allowed. Members of the tribe fished in the nearby streams rather than the lake itself. In the spring and summer months, an abundance of trout could be found in those streams. They smoked the fish and traded it to other tribes, and eventually the white settlers too. Family legends report that Timiko was not Washoe. His true heritage had been lost with time. He did bring many customs to the tribe, traditions and abilities clearly unknown to the Washoe during the 1830s when he happened upon them. The talents Timiko bestowed upon the Washoe could have tied him to any one of 3 tribes: Sioux, Apache, or Navajo. Known as a man of great strength and courage, those qualities initially brought him an invitation and then acceptance into the Washoe tribe. One fateful day, the Washoe's chief found himself cornered against some boulders by a large black bear. His survival was looking pretty dim as the bear moved in closer. But instead of mauling him, as the chief expected, the bear fell at his feet. He had a bowie knife planted in his back. The man responsible, a man the chief had never seen before, stayed on the other side of the bear. The chief was grateful and befriended the stranger who called himself Tomiko. He took him back to the tribal campground and paraded him around as if he had returned with a god. The chief soon learned his savior was also a gifted man, and after realizing the extent of his mystical abilities, he quickly named him the shaman of the tribe. The chief had a beautiful daughter named Leela, who was coveted by all the unmarried men in the tribe, and probably a few married ones as well. She'd never shown any interest in any of them, but that changed when she got one look at Tomiko. According to family tradition, she willingly married the stranger after they fell madly and instantly in love. Of all the couple's children, only Tejon survived into adulthood. Chapter 11. Tomiko mixed up several concoctions and used them to heal Maggie. He would never deny his medicine to anyone who needed it, no matter who they were. Still, he was a little surprised when his son brought home a white woman who'd been shot. He could guess that she must be in some sort of trouble, and for some reason his son had felt a compelling need to help her. Maggie lay unconscious in Tejon's dwelling for the better part of a week. During that time, he constantly stayed by her side, nursing her back to health. The fact that she hadn't woken up yet was starting to make him anxious. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. He didn't know why he wanted her to wake up so badly, but he knew he needed her to. He scrutinized her while she slept. She'd opened her eyes only for a second or two during the last few days, and he didn't think she'd realized where she was when she did it. At first, he relished watching her sleep, enjoying her beauty. But after a few days, he came to know an emptiness that grew from her inactivity. The fact that she never moved, wouldn't wake up, left him with a hollow feeling. Tomiko entered the lodge, and Tejon looked at him. "Her fever has broken," he said in his native tongue. "Has she come to yet?" Tomiko asked. "No, not yet." "She will," Tomiko said with a measure of certainty. "It's just a matter of time." After his father left, Tejon returned to her side. She moaned, and her eyes crept open. Looking up at him, her eyes were void of fear, something Tejon found a little odd, since he knew the wild tales the whites enjoyed spreading about the savage natives. "You," Tejon said in sparse English, "are good?" He hadn't had much practice with the white man's language, so his words came slowly and with a great deal of consideration. She said nothing, but anxiety glazed her eyes. Yes, she was coming to. Now she realized where she was, in the presence of an Indian. Slowly, she pushed herself up and tugged his rabbit-skin blanket up against her, as if it offered her protection. She couldn't help the bit of nerves creeping in. Where was she? And how had she come to be here? With him? "I'm going to die." But she doubted that would be the worst fate he could bestow upon her. What could be worse than dying? Torture, without dying. Just day in and day out, relentless torture. After a few days, Maggie had regained most of her strength. She spent her days inside his lodge, trying to devise a plan for escape. Not that she really felt like a prisoner, but truth be told, she didn't know why she was here in this place. The warrior came in carrying 2 dishes piled with food. A smile splashed across his face upon seeing her sitting by the fire, he took a seat less than a foot away from her and handed her one of the dishes. Maggie accepted it with a bit of reluctance. She looked down at the bowl and studied its contents, thinking it might be some kind of fish. She still wasn't sure she wasn't in danger, and tried but failed miserably at resisting the fear mounting inside her gut. She put on her bravest front and offered up gratitude in its place. "Thank you." She hoped he wasn't a threat to her. Tejon smiled, and excitement tingled in her stomach. But such an attraction would be perilous, a risk she could not afford to take. Needing a distraction, Maggie concentrated on her hunger instead. She scooped up the food with her fingers and tried it. Fish, and good, too. She ate the food he'd given her and kept a cautious eye on him. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am called Tejon," he said in battered English. "Your name?" "Maggie. Everybody calls me Maggie." One look into his deep, smoldering eyes, and she was lost, unable to tear her gaze away. Curiosity wrangled with her infatuation. "How did you learn to speak English?" "White traders," he said. "I speak little. My mother speak little, but that is all." "You understand me well enough." A relaxing wave of serenity breezed past her. "Or so it would seem." "Yes," he nodded. "Understand much better than speak." Maggie's gaze rolled around the lodge. Her thoughts dragged her back to him. He's an Indian. The need to panic shuddered through her. Was she in danger? For a split second, fear pierced her thoughts. As if he sensed her anxiety, he caressed her hand with a soft, gentle touch. Maggie wasn't prepared for the hunger that rushed her body. "You okay," he said. "I do not hurt." Maggie looked at his hand, still on hers, and then her gaze drifted back up to his. "How did I get here?" she asked, his burning eyes holding her still. "Find you in forest," he said. "You are shot." He pointed to her saddlebags. "Carry white man's money." She pulled her hand away from him, closed her eyes, and massaged her forehead. She'd forgotten about that. Chapter 12. The days passed, and Maggie grew stronger until she was as close to 100% as she was going to get. She'd been telling herself for several days that she needed to get back home. Her grandfather and her sisters were probably worried about her, but it seemed every time she was close to making the decision to leave, Tejon would walk in and give her a smile that held a spark of eroticism, and her heart would melt. She convinced herself that staying for a little while longer was the smart thing to do. The sheriff would still be looking for the bank robbers, and a fresh gunshot wound would be hard to explain. At this time, it was best not to draw attention to herself or her family. And what better place to hide than among the Washoe? Not many white people ventured into their camp. Just a few trappers and traders here and there, but they weren't local. She doubted the authorities knew the bank robbers were women, so if any of them saw wanted posters in town, it was doubtful they'd equate them with her. Yes, staying was the best thing to do. Better than inviting trouble by traveling alone. Summers around Lake Tahoe were fleeting, and nighttime temperatures were always cool, if not a little chilly. In the early morning hours, it wasn't unusual to find remnants of a fire smoldering from the night before. On one of those chilly mornings, Maggie was up early and sitting by the fire when Tejon came in. He gave her a smile she was coming to cherish. "You are good?" he asked, with genuine interest.
"Yes," she said. "Thank you."
Then she saw the slash gouged into the side of his deerskin shirt. She was on her feet and at his side before her brain caught up.
"Your shirt!"
She reached out to him.
"Are you hurt?"
Tejon stiffened, backing away. "No!" He wasn't trying to shut her out. Neither his nature nor his custom approved of showing weakness, and making a big deal out of a little scratch was a clear display of vulnerability. Maggie latched onto his arm.
"I was only going to say—"
She didn't let go, even though he made a half-hearted attempt at pulling away.
"I can fix it, if you have a needle and thread."
Tejon hesitated, studying her with a stony yet curious gaze. A slight smile curled the corners of his mouth.
"You are kind." "Are you bleeding?"
Anxiety burned her cheeks. She didn't like thinking he could be injured. He dropped his gaze as he lifted his shirt and revealed a superficial wound that had trickled a bit of blood. Her throat seemed to close up. She choked out the words.
"You are hurt."
Tejon grabbed her hand and held it away from the lesion. "It is nothing." Great. His male ego was alive and well.
"Oh, don't do that. You took care of me. Now let me do the same for you."
He seemed to be searching for the right words in English. "Not hurt." Maggie wanted to take care of him, like he'd done for her. But getting him to let that happen was about to give her a headache from banging her head against his steadfast wall of ego. As far as Tejon was concerned, he wasn't hurt. He didn't need any help. But he'd allow her to mend his clothing, if that was her wish. Maggie had gotten the sewing supplies from Tejon's mother, and now she was back in his lodge, mending his clothing. The equivalent of the English word amazing crossed his thoughts in his native language. She truly was the most alluring creature he'd ever seen, and something about her made him crazy. He was no longer content being one of the happy-go-lucky, unmarried men in the tribe. The idea of charming all the girls and committing to none had lost its appeal. Now, the only thing that brought him pleasure was the thought of coming back to the campsite and finding Maggie in his lodge. When she finished mending his garment, she singed the thick, coarse thread with the heat of the fire, then turned the shirt right side out and moved closer to him. She draped the garment against her chest and looked at him.
"What do you think?"
she asked, looking down at the shirt and then back up at him again.
"Not bad, huh?"
The sparkle in her green eyes spilled out onto her face and tugged up the corners of her mouth. He took the shirt, inspected her handwork, and then looked back at her. "It is good." He nodded. "Thank you." That evening, Maggie lay in her bedding on the other side of the fire from Tejon. He was sleeping, or at least she thought so. The glow of the flames cast a dim light over his appealing face, raw-boned and free of any sign of whiskers. She liked looking at him when he was sleeping. She didn't have to worry about him catching her staring or anything embarrassing like that. Her judgment was captivated, imprisoned by thoughts of the man who'd saved her. It left her daydreaming about the possibilities of what tomorrow could bring. By all accounts, she should be afraid of him, and maybe she was, a little in the beginning. Tejon had made it easy for her to quickly see she had nothing to fear from him. The light of the fire cast a dim glow over his brown skin. Her gaze traveled across his body, eyeing the rippled physique of his well-defined torso. His dark hair cascaded down past his shoulders. She fancied the notion of running her fingers through it to see if it was as thick and as coarse as it looked. She wanted his long hair, no matter what its texture was, to hang down over her face while he towered above her as they made love. Chapter 13. The days continued to flutter away, but Maggie couldn't muster the desire to go home. After spending the last few weeks with Tejon, she wanted to stay with him forever. And they hadn't even kissed, much less anything else. She wondered if the Indians kissed each other. If they did it in private. She'd never seen anything more than passing glances from the couples as they went about their daily business. She wanted Tejon to look at her that way, even if it was only fleeting. Possessing such contentment in her newfound home, she'd taken to wearing Indian garb. She found great pleasure in taking part in the tribe's way of life. Sitting cross-legged between Tejon's mother and his aunt, Maggie was contented while learning their art of beadwork. Everyone added their own special touch to the pouches they were making out of deerskin, an art that Tomiko had brought to the tribe. He'd taught Tejon's mother, Leela, how to do it, and soon all the women in the tribe were eager to learn. And now Leela taught Maggie. To the delight of both Leela and her sister, the young white girl had turned out to be a quick study. When Maggie was done, she ended up with a satisfactory pouch adorned in red, yellow, and blue beadwork. Leela wanted Maggie to feel comfortable with the tribe. She knew Tejon was falling for the young white woman. She saw it in his eyes. First when he talked about her, and later every time he looked at her. She had a pretty good idea that Maggie felt the same way, and since they both were moving painfully slow, she decided she'd have to give them a little push. Maggie inspected her handiwork.
"Now, what I do with it?" "Give to Tejon,"
Layla coaxed in English.
"Sure, okay."
Maggie gave a little shrug and pushed herself up from the ground. She went to look for him and found him inside his lodge, stacking firewood for the coming days. Maggie had been living in his dwelling, but they had not shared a bed. Tejon glanced at her. The light in his eyes agreed with the smile that came to his mouth. Maggie went to him, the heat of her blush singeing her cheeks. She had a hard time making eye contact. She didn't know why. She just did.
"Here."
She handed him the pouch.
"This is for you."
She cleared her throat, surprised by the amount of nervous anxiety mounting inside her.
"Your mother taught me how to make it."
He leapt to his feet.
"You make for me?"
He touched her fingertips as he took the pouch.
"Does my mother tell you what it means to give to me?"
Her forehead wrinkled. Disappointment fell over him.
"She does not."
He released the pouch back into Maggie's hands.
"The women, they make these for husband," he said. "Or for the one they wish to be husband."
"Great." Maggie felt a flush blistering across her face. Did he have any idea she lay awake at night dreaming about him having his way with her?
"Well, I guess the significance doesn't really matter, does it?"
She hoped her tone was as trivial as her words.
"I made it for you."
She offered the pouch to him again.
"Do you want it or not?"
Chapter 14. Tejon and Maggie spent much of their free time at a place that would one day be known as Vista Point. Huge rocks and boulders had been placed amid the trees with such aesthetic strategy it was as if the gods themselves had put them there. Off in the distance, the lake served as a magnificent backdrop with snow-covered mountains towering behind it. They were sitting side by side on the edge of a boulder jutting out of the ground like a bench.
"I really don't know how to thank you for everything that you've done for me," she said, her tone oozing with gratefulness.
He had his hands clasped in front of him, holding on to one wrist with the other hand.
"You are welcome,"
he said, crooking his head sideways to look at her.
"Why don't you keep the money I had on me when you found me?"
She marveled at the notion, realizing what she'd suggested. Where in the hell had that come from? She didn't want to leave. Then again, maybe staying wasn't as much of an option as she'd initially hoped. She'd been there for weeks, and he'd never attempted, not once, to lay a finger on her. Like now, for instance. Their legs had brushed together more than once. Instead of taking her in his arms, he was holding them prisoner in his lap, while she was dying to feel the heat of his bare skin against hers. "You go away?" There was a weakness in his voice that she hadn't heard before.
"It's probably time that I get out of your hair."
She made the mistake of looking at him. One look into his dark eyes, beautiful like black silk, and she couldn't help herself. No way she could leave without touching him. Feeling the tears moistening her eyes, she trailed her fingertip over his cheek and down his jaw. He draped his hand over hers, pressing her palm against his face. "You stay with me," he said, and it was no question. "You be my wife. I take care of you, never hurt." Tears splashed from her eyes and fell down onto her cheeks. Her heart hammered gleefully. He pulled her against him. "Maggie, do not leave me." His whisper blew hot against her cheek. He tightened his embrace and let his caresses explore a body that was more than willing to accept his touch.
"I can't think of any place I'd rather be," she said. "Or anything I'd rather do than stay here and be your wife."
Much to her disappointment and confusion, Tejon released her. He reached into the pouch hanging at his side and pulled out an intricately detailed turquoise necklace. He offered it to her.
"This is for me?"
she asked, taking the magnificent piece of jewelry.
"It's beautiful."
He fastened the necklace around her neck and turned her around, pulling her back into his arms. Invading her mouth with his, he kissed her for the first time. Their lips touched, stealing Maggie's breath away. His soft, sensual kisses robbed her of every ounce of reasoning she could ever hope to possess. Tangling his fingers in her silky, smooth hair, his need to have her ached for relief. He'd wanted her from the first moment he'd laid eyes on her. But Tejon wasn't the type of man to push himself on a woman. And the last thing he wanted to do was scare her away. Instead, he'd resolved to bide his time and wait until the moment was right. His patience had finally paid off. Maggie wanted him, and she wanted him now. She'd lain awake too many nights, wondering.
"You said,"
between his kisses, she spoke in an almost whisper,
"you wanted me to be your wife. How exactly do we make that happen?"
That must have been what he was waiting for.
"It happened when you said yes." "That's it?"
She froze and stared up at him.
"You mean we're married?"
"Is that what the white man calls it?" He flashed her an enticing grin.
"Yes."
She felt the need to lay down some ground rules.
"You know, later on, you can't toss me aside now that you've made this commitment."
Tejon rubbed her red locks between his fingers. "We belong to each other." He gave her hair a little tug, pulling her toward him. You have my heart. Forever. He brushed his lips against hers.
I'm interested in more than your heart.
She trailed her fingertips over his chest and traced the contours of the rock-solid muscles rippling over his stomach. You wish to go back to the village?
No.
She let out a soft moan.
Here's fine.
Tejon scanned the area and ended up yanking the blankets off their horses. He laid them on a flat boulder and then turned back to her. You are sure? She grabbed his arms, pulling him with her as she lay down on the blankets. Just as she'd imagined so many times before, his hair cascaded down in a curtain of black rain, falling all around her face. It was thick, to be sure, but there was nothing coarse or rough about it. It caressed her face and shoulders with a silky softness as he moved above her. When the ritual was complete, joining the soulmates together forever, Tejon lay over Maggie in a state of sheer tranquility. She made no attempt to move, her legs still wrapped around him. Neither of them were capable of moving, nor did they care to. Many things ran through her mind at that time, but her home in California and her background weren't among them. Nothing that crept into her thoughts was allowed to stay unless it was centered around Tejon. He, on the other hand, knew she was hiding from something, or someone, and if he had to guess, he'd say it wasn't good. Not from her people's standpoint, anyway. But he didn't care what her people thought, or his people either, for that matter. All he knew was she'd walked into his life, and now everything had a purpose. Everything he did with her in mind. What joined together in those two that day would prove to be a bond that would last forever. Chapter 15. Now that Maggie was Tejon's wife, she was quite content living with him among the Washoe. The thought of leaving him wasn't something she allowed herself to contemplate. Still, the guilt was there, over her family worrying about her. It ached, clawed, and scratched, trying to break free. Maggie came up with a viable solution. The next time traders passed through, she'd hire them to deliver a message. Even with all the adjustments to her newfound lifestyle, Maggie's heritage and customs still ached to come out. She hadn't forgotten that in her world a married couple used symbols to show their bond, namely wedding rings. But this wasn't a custom of the Washoe. Maggie came upon a solution, though, when she decided to introduce her own version of marital expression to her newfound family. In her need to have material symbols representative of the fact that she and Tejon belonged to one another, she made a pair of matching bracelets out of leather and beads. When she showed them to Tejon, at first he didn't understand. "What's this?" He looked at the items in her hand, and then back at her.
Well,
she stalled, thinking she'd have to talk him into wearing them.
In my world, when a man and a woman marry, they exchange gold rings.
He was never going to go for this.
And since we don't have any, I made these.
She held out the bracelets.
If we wear them, they'll be a symbol of our love for each other.
This will make you happy? He asked.
Well,
she thought about it.
I'm already happy, but this is one way to ensure my continued happiness.
If this makes you happy. And there was that devilishly handsome grin of his again. We will wear them. Maggie tied the larger bracelet on his left wrist, just as a wedding ring belongs on the left hand. Once done, she handed the other bracelet to him and held out her left arm. Tejon followed her lead and tied the bracelet onto her wrist. As he did, he gazed at her, kissing her with his eyes. She was about to get lost in his eyes when his lips feather-touched hers with tantalizing persuasion. The touch of his mouth was as soft as a whisper. She opened her mouth, encouraging him to come inside. Chapter 16. Among the Washoe, since there was no ritualistic ceremony to join a man and woman together, couples simply decided they would unite, and from that day forward, everyone in the tribe considered them to be married. And so it was with Maggie and Tejon. Their union was well received by the tribe's members, especially Layla, Tejon's mother. She knew her son was crazy about Maggie, and she also knew that if Maggie left, Tejon would never get over it. Tomiko knew what it was like to be the outsider looking in, loving someone that you were certain could belong to anyone but you. When Layla's father initiated the marriage between his daughter and Tomiko never forgot what that felt like. Even though he had his reservations about the young white woman, who he was certain carried a sizable burden, he accepted it with grace, because he wanted his son to be happy. And according to his wife, this young white woman was the only thing in this world that would ever make their son happy. The children in the tribe also loved the new pairing. Not only did they have Tejon, who played with them, but now they had Maggie too. Maggie and Tejon's days were filled with joy and pleasure as they enjoyed a carefree lifestyle right alongside the children. They too were prone to play together like children rather than act like married adults. Well, maybe teenagers. It never took long for their playful antics to lead from one thing to another. When that happened, one of them always initiated a game of hide-and-seek with the children, which is how the couple always made their escape. Disguised as an effort to find a hiding place, the couple would run off and disappear, vanishing high up into the hills where the children were never allowed to follow. Even though the children never attempted to go after them, Maggie and Tejon continued on with their game of hide-and-seek as if nothing had changed. He could read her like a book, always knowing where to find her after she disappeared. Once he got her in his sights, he'd call after her playfully, "I will get you, girl." Maggie would duck behind a tree, catching her breath. She could always sense when he was getting close. She'd dart out like a flash and run off. Every time Tejon got near her, she'd scream with a joyful delight that filtered through the forest. Upon occasion, their escapades found them on the shores of Lake Tahoe. By this time, he'd inevitably caught up with her. She'd try to lead him back into the trees once she saw where they were, but he'd catch her, pulling her back toward the lake. The couple's laughter would fill the air. Maggie would somehow resist his capture, running away, and Tejon would continue his pursuit playfully. He'd pick her up and carry her back toward the water, laughing light-heartedly while Maggie giggled and screamed, all at the same time. As they approached the water's edge, she'd cling to him, as if this was the time he'd toss her in. Of course, he never did. Planting her feet in a couple of inches of water was the extent of his reprisal. By then, it was almost time. They'd head for their special place, now known as Vista Point. By the time they got there, Maggie had more often than not caught her second wind. Her constant jumping around and climbing over the boulders made Tejon nervous. The more she messed around, the more uncomfortable he became with her reckless abandon. Eventually, she'd get to the point of carelessness. Tejon always motioned for her to come down, and she always mocked him with playful gestures. Sometimes she slipped and fell into his arms. The magnetic power between the two of them was too much for either to overcome, and they'd invariably end up kissing. Their mutual attraction drew them into their own private world, derived in passion. On this day, Maggie's conscience got the better of her. It seemed that after making love with Tejon, she was always at her weakest. It was then that she was the most vulnerable. She lay on her side with her back to him. He propped himself up on his elbow and glanced down at her. With a tender, soft touch, he caressed her hair back out of her face. "What is wrong?" She turned over and faced him.
"I married you under false pretenses."
"What do you mean?" A frown wrinkled his brow. "Is there another in your white world?" His tone sharpened. "You left that world behind when I found you. Your world is with me now." She shook her head.
"There's no one else. There could never be anyone else."
She touched his face, running her fingers along his strong jawline.
"And you're right. My world is with you now."
"Then why are you so sad?" he asked in a much calmer tone. She hesitated, summoning the courage to tell on herself.
"I have to tell you who I am, or was."
She looked away, wanting to hide her humiliation. For the first time, she was ashamed of who she was.
"My sisters and I,"
she looked back at him,
"we robbed banks. That's how I got shot, and that's why I had all that money with me when you found me."
"Did the money bring you happiness?" he asked, much too casually for what he'd just heard. She thought about it before saying,
"I thought it did."
"And now?"
"Well, now I realize I was wrong."
"The white man's money has no value here." His tone was calm but firm. "But you must never do it again."
"I won't."
She sighed and drew him into her arms.
"Please, don't be mad at me."
"I do not care that you stole from the white man," he said. "But you have a new family now, and you must never steal from any of them."
"I love these people,"
she said, almost hurt.
"I would never do anything to harm any of them."
Guilt washed over Tejon, and he felt bad for saying it. He'd known she'd probably done some bad things in her white world, and now that she'd admitted stealing from her own people, he had to be certain she was clear. She could never do it again. He knew he'd offended her, and he couldn't leave the rift between them. "You are a liar," he said in firm, yet playful tone.
"What?"
Fire practically shot out from her eyes.
"You must have been a very good thief, where you came from,"
he said, and lay back down.
"Why would you say that?"
She didn't know whether to be mad or scared.
"When you came to us, you started with my heart, and did not stop until you stole everyone else's."
He laughed, pulling her on top of him.
"You stole my heart."
He kissed her with lips that were more persuasive than she cared to admit.
"Don't try to deny it."
"Oh, yeah?" Laughter carried her words on the air.
"Is that all I've managed to get away with? That's not all I was after."
Chapter 17. Maggie could have easily remained with Tejon and his people, sharing and living out the rest of their lives blissfully happy. That is, if the outside world hadn't come crashing back down around them. When it did, neither of them expected it. Therefore, neither of them were ready for it. They'd been out most of the day, and now, as they headed back to camp, they laughed and talked, enthralled in each other. Tejon was carrying a batch of trout he'd caught. Maggie had a basket of wild berries and edible roots and bulbs she'd gathered while Tejon was fishing. "I want to give your mom some of the pine nuts I found," she said. The elders' circle in the middle of the campsite pulled her attention away from Tejon. She scanned the circle, more out of curiosity than anything else, since she knew it had to be a pretty special occasion for it to happen without notice. An important visitor, perhaps? The last person she expected to see was her grandfather, Bradford Fuller. Maggie froze. Her basket of goods fell to the ground. Tejon glanced back and forth between Maggie and the tribal council. He zeroed in on the older white man sitting among his people and recognized him instantly. Bradford Fuller was a frequent and welcomed visitor among the Washoe. He was in the habit of traveling up 3 or 4 times a year to visit and trade with the tribe. Maggie's reaction to the familiar guest twisted Tejon's nerves around his gut. He turned to her. "Do you know him?" he asked, even though he didn't want to hear the answer. He didn't need to. He could tell by her reaction that the white trader, who also happened to be a frequent visitor among his people, was more than a simple trader to her. She looked at the council and then back at Tejon. "He's my grandfather." Tejon's nerves instantly relaxed. He took her hand, ignoring the spilled basket, and led her toward the group. Bradford Fuller's gaze landed on Maggie and Tejon, and his face paled. It was as if he'd seen a ghost, which of course was the logical conclusion since he'd thought she was dead. Mary had returned home with the news of Molly's death. She and her grandfather had waited for Maggie to show up, but their wait had been in vain. After weeks of waiting and nothing ever coming from it, they accepted that Maggie must have suffered the same fate as her sister Molly. "That's my granddaughter!" Bradford pointed to Maggie. He wrestled his urge to jump up. Instead, he waited respectfully for Tamiko and the tribe's chief to stand, so he was free to go to her without offense. Maggie dropped Tejon's hand and ran into Bradford's arms. "We thought you were dead too," he said. She backed away, surveying his face with a grave look. "Two?" "Your sister, Molly," he nearly choked on the words, "is dead." That proved to be a little more than Maggie could handle. Her ability to reason deserted her. Then her thoughts faded, and consciousness abandoned her. Maggie slumped to the ground. Bradford Fuller gave his granddaughter precious little time to recover from his difficult news. It didn't take him long to drag her off, hoping to make her see the error of her ways. Maggie strolled in the direction of Vista Point with him following behind. She leaned against a giant boulder, and he stood over her like a troubled parent. She tried her best to ignore him because she knew what was coming. She didn't want to hear it, and she certainly didn't have to like it. But that didn't stop him. "You understand that you have to leave here, don't you?" Maggie could almost feel the fire flickering from her eyes. "I can't leave him." Her tone was undeniable and her words final. "I could sooner stop breathing than leave him." "The longer you stay here," he said in a calm manner, "the more danger you're putting him in. They killed your sister down in Carson City, and if they get one look at you," he said of the white lawman, "they're going to know you were one of her accomplices." He wasn't overlooking the similarities between Maggie and Molly. They both had red hair, and they looked alike. Mary was the different one, with hair as dark as night. "I can't leave him." Her words trailed off on an injured tone. "You're wanted," he said. "Remember?" Yes, and up until now, as far as she knew, she'd been an unidentified party. But now that she knew Molly had been identified, this was not a safe place for Maggie to hide. Not safe for her, not safe for Tejon, and not safe for his people. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes. "I'm thankful that he found you and nursed you back to health," he said with a measure of compassion. "But if you truly love him, you'll leave here with me tomorrow, before they find you and he ends up dying trying to protect you." Her grandfather's words crashed down around her a little too harshly. Even so, they rang of pure truth. Once Tejon heard that Bradford intended to take Maggie back to California the next day, he was overcome with anger. Inside his own grandfather's lodge, Tehon paced the length of the interior, while Tomeko and his grandfather, the chief, looked on. He stopped, as if a cold wind had frozen his body, and turned to face his elders.
"I will not let him take her,"
he said in his native tongue.
"It's not your choice,"
Tomeko replied in the same language.
"And she's in danger here."
Tomeko hoped to reason with his son, yet fearing there would be no way of reckoning with him.
"The girl must be returned to her grandfather,"
the chief finally spoke, issuing the final words on the matter. And those were the worst words in the whole world for Tehon. His grandfather's word was law. The tribal council decided Tehon's wife would not accompany him to his lodge that night. Doing so could make it all the more difficult to separate them in the morning. Just before daybreak, Tehon emerged from his lodge. Having had all night to wallow in his anger, it had swelled to the breaking point.
How dare they?
How dare his own people attempt to take away the only thing that had ever meant anything to him? Maggie emerged from a nearby lodge. It had been drilled into her head all night of the danger she'd be bringing to Tehon if she stayed. They'd all tried to make her feel guilty, and they'd done a pretty good job of it, too. She didn't want to bring danger to him. Why couldn't they see that? She loved him more than life itself. In fact, she couldn't imagine life without him. How in the world was she supposed to go back to California and put on this farce of a pretense that she was happy about it? She didn't know how she was supposed to survive without him. But everyone seemed so certain of one thing. If she stayed, Tehon would die. Bradford led Maggie past Tehon. She paused, gazing into his eyes. She wished she could tell him it was a bad joke, that everything was going to be okay. But that was a lie. It wasn't going to be okay. Nothing was ever going to be okay again. Bradford gave Maggie a tug, prompting her away from Tehon's side. Her eyes never left Tehon's steady gaze as she was led away. Tehon had put forth a good front on the outside, but inside he was dying. His heart was breaking. The fact that she could actually walk away from him was killing him. Bradford nudged Maggie to get on the horse. She did it, in an almost trance-like state, and turned back for one last look. Tears were starting to smear her vision. Even so, she could see his stone-faced glare. Tehon didn't take his eyes off of her until she and her grandfather disappeared from view. He went back inside his lodge and emerged again shortly. His anger was spilling over. He mounted his horse and took off in the opposite direction.